I have always been a fan of hiking adventures. The forest was my way of escaping everything that weighed me down. No car noise, no people, just fresh air and silence that penetrates you to the very bones. This time, as always, I took my backpack, tent, and some food supplies. It was the perfect trip, allowing me to feel truly alive. But something was wrong. From the very beginning, I felt as if someone invisible was watching me. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe nerves or fatigue were getting to me. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more oppressive this feeling became, and I could no longer find peace. To be honest, I decided to stop only because the day was coming to an end. The sun was setting, and I needed to find a campsite. After making my way between tall pines, I came across a small clearing. The place seemed safe enough and suitable for an overnight stay, so I decided to set up my tent there. But even as I began to settle in, the feeling didn't leave me. It was as if someone invisible was standing nearby, watching me closely. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a fire. I watched the flames flicker in the darkness, trying to calm myself. Eventually, I started convincing myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination. Just tired, everything's fine, I repeated, but deep down I felt something was off. The forest had become unnervingly quiet. Truly quiet. So quiet that even my own breathing seemed too loud, almost too sharp amidst the absolute silence. And then it happened. A barely audible snap of a twig. I jerked my head up and stared into the darkness between the trees. Maybe it was a deer, or perhaps some forest creature. I couldn't say, but it didn't matter. It was enough to make my nerves reach their breaking point. I shot into the darkness. "Hey! Who's there?" And again, silence. Absolute, deafening silence. I felt the anxiety grow to its peak, as though someone was standing very close, but I couldn't see them. I no longer trusted myself and quickly moved closer to the fire, trying to feel at least a little bit of protection. The next day, I decided to leave the forest as early as possible, but by then it no longer mattered. I felt that something was wrong here, and the forest didn't want me to leave. That night, I slept in fits and starts, hearing every sound. Every noise seemed so loud that I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like someone was walking around my tent, though every time I looked, there was nothing there. Maybe I had just lost my calm again, but that didn't help. The morning brought me a temporary sense of relief. The sun was breaking through the tall treetops, and the birdsong seemed to calm my nerves. I even felt a bit foolish for having been so anxious during the night. However, as soon as I began packing up my camp, my sense of relaxation vanished abruptly. Around my tent, I noticed tracks. These weren't the usual animal tracks I was familiar with. They formed a strange, almost ritualistic circular pattern. The tracks couldn't be human. There were no toes, and the size of the prints was enormous. I bent closer, trying to figure out what they could be. They definitely didn't belong to any normal forest creature. Maybe it was some strange prank, but I couldn't understand how that was possible. Where were these people? I hadn't seen a single soul within miles. Trying not to panic, I quickly packed my things and set off. I knew I had to get out of this cursed forest by evening. But the further I walked, the more I felt the trees closing in around me. It was as though I was walking into a trap, and all the paths I had used yesterday had simply disappeared. The forest had become unfamiliar, hostile. I took out my compass. The needle, which should have pointed north, spun erratically, like a broken clock. It only confirmed that something was wrong here, and all of this wasn't a coincidence. A wave of anxiety washed over me. Then I heard it again, a whisper. It was all around me, yet at the same time, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The words were unclear, barely audible, but the sound was sharp, as if someone was standing right next to me, whispering directly into my ear. My heart began to race in my chest as I realized, this wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something alive. Something I couldn't understand. I froze, trying to understand where the whisper was coming from. It could be the wind, I thought. Just the wind, nothing more. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't a natural sound. The whisper was rhythmic, as though someone was speaking words in a strange, unfamiliar language that I couldn't understand. I tried to move forward, attempting to ignore the ominous sound. The forest, however, seemed endless, as if I had fallen into a trap where every tree looked the same. The paths I had walked on just moments ago suddenly disappeared as soon as I tried to step on them, and I found myself in a new, unfamiliar part of the woods. The whisper didn't stop. On the contrary, it grew louder, as if something was drawing closer to me. My nervousness intensified, and I could no longer control myself. I started running, not paying attention to the direction. My legs stumbled over roots, branches whipped across my face, but I ignored the pain. All that was in my mind was one thing: to run. To run as far as I could. I stopped for a few seconds to catch my breath, but then I saw it. For the first time. The silhouette stood several dozen meters away from me, half hidden between the trees, like a shadow blending into the darkness. It was tall, too thin, almost skeletal, wrapped in dry skin. I couldn't make out its face. It was hidden in the shadow. But I knew it wasn't human, and I understood this instinctively, with every fiber of my being. "Who are you?" I shouted, trying to make my voice sound firm, though I could feel my hands trembling with fear. It didn't answer. It didn't even move. It just stood there, motionless, watching me with its dark eyes. I took a few steps back, trying not to take my eyes off it. But as soon as I turned to figure out where to run next, the silhouette vanished. It just dissolved into the air, as if it had never been there. And I was left alone, with the feeling that I wouldn't leave this forest alive if I didn't run with all my strength. The disappearance of the silhouette didn't bring relief. On the contrary, the feeling of anxiety only intensified. Now I was certain, it hadn't disappeared, it had simply moved. I couldn't see it, but I felt its presence. It was everywhere. I knew it was watching me now, though I couldn't make it out in the darkness of the forest. Steps began to echo from all directions. It was as though someone was carefully stepping between the trees, trying not to reveal themselves, but that only heightened my fear. Could it be just my imagination? Maybe I was just overthinking? I don't know, but suddenly, I saw it again. This time, it was closer. It stood between the trees, no more than a few meters away from me. Its thin arms hung down, like dead branches growing from its body. I couldn't see its face, it remained hidden in the shadow, but one thing was clear: its eyes. They were black voids, bottomless, so terrifying that I felt a cold shiver run down my skin. My ability to reason evaporated instantly. I could no longer stay in one place. Every instinct screamed for me to run, and I couldn't stop it. I bolted forward, not even thinking about what was going on around me. The bushes tore at my pants, branches whipped across my arms and face, but I didn't stop. My goal was clear: get out of here. My lungs burned for air, and my legs barely obeyed me. I didn't stop, even when I felt my strength fading. And then, when I dared to look back, hoping that it was no longer following me, I saw emptiness. It had vanished again. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, a hallucination created by fear and frayed nerves. But at that moment I heard it again. The whisper. It rang right behind me, clear and distinct, as if someone was standing right behind me, whispering words I couldn't understand. I kept running for several more minutes when I suddenly saw something ahead. A house. Old, wooden, almost leaning. It seemed like it would collapse any moment, but it was the only chance I had left. I rushed to the door, grabbed the handle, and shoved it with all my body weight. The wooden door gave way under my force, and I stumbled inside. Inside, it was dark and damp, the air heavy and stagnant. It felt as though the house had been abandoned for a long time. But at that moment, it didn't matter. I needed to stop, just for a moment, and regain my strength. I quickly shut the door behind me and started searching for something to barricade it with. The furniture in the room was old and covered in dust, but it would do. I moved it to the door, trying to create at least a minimal barrier. But then I saw it. On the wall, near one of the windows, were strange symbols. The patterns were chaotic, as though someone had carved them with a knife or some other sharp object directly into the wood. I immediately felt a familiar sensation. These symbols resembled the tracks I had seen around my tent that morning. My heart shuddered and beat faster. Something was wrong. The feeling of that creature's presence didn't leave me. I scanned the room for anything useful, and on the floor, I found an old notebook. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the text on them looked partially blurred, as though it had been written in haste, in the dark. I flipped open one of the pages, and when I was able to make out what was written, I felt the cold seep into me from within. If you're reading this, he already knows you're here. And you won't escape. The silence in the cabin didn't last long. At first, I heard a faint scratching at the door. Then another. It became regular, rhythmic, as if someone or something was continuously testing the door's strength, checking if it could be broken through. It wasn't just unsettling, it was desperate. And I realized it wasn't a coincidence. I darted around, looking for anything that I could use to protect myself. The only thing I found was a rusty knife on an old kitchen table. It wasn't the best option, but honestly, at that moment, any weapon was better than none. I grabbed it, feeling the cold metal in my hand. I approached the door, trying not to make any unnecessary movements, when suddenly the scratching stopped. Everything froze. Just silence. I started to wonder if it was all in my head. But then, a moment later, when I looked through the window, through which a few rays of light were streaming, I saw it. The silhouette. The same unforgettable one I had seen before. It was standing there, closer than ever. And this time, I knew for sure, it was waiting for me. And if I didn't do something immediately, I would become just another part of this forest shadow. I stood still, gripping the rusty knife so tightly that my hand trembled from the strain. I didn't even try to hide it because I knew there was no point in hiding my fear. The silhouette outside the window didn't move. It just stood there, and its empty, merciless eyes seemed to pierce straight through me, tearing my soul apart. "What do you want?" I whispered, though I honestly didn't expect an answer. Silence. The scratching had stopped, but in its place, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy steps, each one deliberate, as if choosing each movement so I could clearly hear every sound. The steps circled the cabin, and even now, I could feel the air around me becoming heavier. I turned to the window on the right and saw it again, at the same distance. It hadn't moved, hadn't gotten closer, but its presence became more and more palpable. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. One question spun in my mind: what if this cabin wasn't a refuge, but a trap? Was I truly safe here inside? I was alone, with a rusty knife and my panic. But it was out there, just outside. I cautiously moved closer to the door and pressed my ear to the old wood. Silence. But suddenly, I heard a faint sound, as though something heavy was moving across the roof. My heart stopped for a moment, and I instinctively looked up. The sounds became clearer. These were footsteps, but not on the ground, on the wooden planks of the roof. It was above me. Every step was so loud that I could hardly breathe. I could feel the pressure in my chest growing, and my gaze involuntarily fixed on the gaps between the old wooden planks. Could it see me from there? I didn't know, but that sensation relentlessly gnawed at my mind. Carefully, so as not to give myself away, I moved to another room. It was smaller, likely once a bedroom, but now it was empty and neglected. Along the wall stood a narrow wardrobe, which seemed like my starting point for salvation. With no other options, I hid inside. The space was cramped, but at that moment it felt like a better option than standing in the middle of the room, completely exposed. The footsteps grew heavier, and I felt them nearing the edge of the roof, stopping directly above my hiding spot. My heart pounded in my ears, and its loud thumping seemed to drown out everything else. I froze, trying not to move when I suddenly heard a new sound, a long, drawn-out creak of wood, as if something heavy was crawling down, creeping toward me. The sound made my hair stand on end, and I almost stopped breathing, terrified that every movement would give me away. I knew I couldn't stay in the wardrobe. The rusty knife in my hand was utterly useless against what I was facing, but it was my only weapon, and I couldn't leave it idle. Gathering all my strength, I opened the wardrobe door and leaped into the room. There it was, standing in the doorway, blocking the entire entrance. Its body was unnaturally long and thin, almost skeletal, covered in stretched, paper-thin skin. Its eyes, those same empty voids I had seen earlier, didn't just look at me, they pulled me in, drawing me toward the abyss. And then it spoke. The whisper. The same one that had been haunting me all night. Now, the whisper echoed directly in my mind, like a voice traversing space, penetrating deeper than any sound wave. Its lips didn't move, but the words flowed endlessly, filling the space, overwhelming me with pressure. They were unintelligible, like the rustle of wind, but I understood their meaning. It was a warning, or maybe a sentence. I stepped back, trying to maintain distance, though every movement felt powerless. But it didn't stop. It began to move. And this wasn't just walking, it was sliding. Its body barely touched the floor. It blended with it, gliding like a shadow shifting on the edge of reality and nightmare. I rushed toward the other room, losing every second. I had to find some way out. And then I saw it, the window. It became my only chance to escape whatever was chasing me. I shattered it with the rusty knife, not even thinking about the shards digging into my skin. The moment of pain was unbearable, but I didn't stop. I got to my feet and, without looking back, ran into the darkness of the forest. The forest, which had once seemed like my way of escape, now felt even more unfriendly and hostile. The trees around me were like its body, tall, thin, with dark, empty spaces between them, as if they were watching me, just like it had. When I stopped to catch my breath, I heard its voice again. This time, it was clearer though still alien, as if it didn't belong to this world. You will come again. These words didn't sound like a threat, but more like a promise. And in that moment, I understood, no matter how far I ran, it would always be near. It would always be there. And this would never end. I don't remember how I managed to get out of the forest. One moment, I was running between the trees, and the next, I was standing by the side of the road. I didn't know how I ended up there, and I couldn't understand how much time had passed. A car with a family inside stopped to help me, but I barely spoke to them. My words were jumbled, I couldn't gather my thoughts, and my gaze kept drifting back to the forest, as if something invisible was following me. At home, I was haunted by nightmares. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I would see it again. At first, far away, between the trees, then getting closer. Its shadow became more distinct, and I would wake up in terror, as a whole whisper spilled into my mind. It was there, in every dream, and even when I woke up, I couldn't escape its presence. A few days later, I saw it again. This time, at my window. In its empty eyes, there was no longer just fear, now, they demanded. I knew what it wanted, to take me back to the forest. And I realized I could no longer hide. In running from it, I had only become part of this nightmare. And now I write this for you, for those who may find my journal. If this has happened to you, if it has started hunting you, this is only the beginning. And if you can do what I couldn't, find a way to escape, then perhaps this nightmare will end for you. But not for me. I won't be able to run.